So objectivism and subjectivism, for example, there are elements of both articulations in the way in which, for example, habitus is formed, as he would have it, the way in which embodied dispositions over relatively long period of time gets constituted. And once they get constituted, they have real effects. Just because they are socially constituted, that doesn't mean that they don't have real effects, that they are just merely virtual. And virtually no one I know in social constructivist mode actually would claim that. But yet in the same vein, in the literature, these dichotomies are drawn. And then it is as though speaking about or adopting constructivism means that reality doesn't really matter much because we see things socially constructed. But that is really a false dichotomy that we learn. Now, having learned that, there are other things that we have learned. And I have used another trilogy. It's not a trilogy. How did I come up with that? There are actually 5 of them. My kind of trilogy with 5 edges. Obviously, I'm not Euclidean in geometric terms. What I found difficult as well as useful to use in terms of understanding the process of social formation of identities, both individual as well as social groups, is that I think Helen said very eloquently earlier that one fundamental inescapable condition of being human is that we are born into this tension of being absolutely unique and absolutely non-unique at the same time. That we want to be like others, but we want to be like ourselves or our very own selves. And that there's that tension that is inescapable. In working our way through that inescapable tension, one of the things that I've learned from particularly now at the Open University, I'm learning the language psychosocial, but I would have typically called psychoanalytical insight, that in fact, as we do that, we also distribute ourselves across a spectrum of identities multiply. We situate ourselves and work our way through being insiders of certain groups, but at the same time, perhaps because we respond to that absolute need to differentiate ourselves, we also constitute certain others as strangers. Strangers to whom we can relate to. We can perhaps use the same language, but nonetheless, the distance that separates us is real. And then still further, we can differentiate those whom we might call outsiders. We have a bit more animosity toward them. Maybe we don't even use the same idiom, but perhaps we do understand that we coexist. The fundamental acceptance of social coexistence gets involved in the question of outsiders. And then there's those aliens who may have nothing to do with us, and we may want to have nothing to do with them. Those are alienated subjectivities, but nonetheless, we might still accept the fact that we are thrown in together. And then there's the idea of, despite the fact that we share neither language, nor ways of being, nor ways of seeing, and yet at the same time, there's a fundamental, perhaps, humanity that we share, and that the recognition of that, even though the other is the alien. And then there's, of course, time and again, we see the enactment of a kind of identity or group identity that we could call abjection. In this case, the point is really not to even accept the humanity of the other. This is Agamben's bare life, in a sense that the other is even not considered to have the rights that humans should have by virtue of human. And we, of course, have unfortunate but all too obvious examples of that abjection in variety of spaces that we could call abject spaces around the world, from Guantanamo Bay to other forms of camps and frontiers and zones that have been created. Now, these kinds of identities, research goes on, and in its own way, it makes contributions to our complex ways of understanding how we form ourselves as social beings in this world. Then, of course, we talked about conduct of conduct, action, enactment, governance, and so on. There's also the constituents of citizenship, the elements, fundamental elements of citizenship that also are talked about quite widely in citizenship studies. So, for example, in the last 10 years, we have seen new subjects of citizenship. New subjects of citizenship in the sense that those who were not necessarily considered as part of citizenship idiom actually have come to articulate certain subjectivities that force themselves into the idiom of citizenship. We can give some complex examples of these and also simple examples of this. Who would have thought even 20 years ago we would have had elaborate machinery to make access possible for disabled persons in many institutions around the city? Actual physical change. Because disabled people or people with disabilities have become subjects of citizenship, or in a way you could say they have made themselves a subject of citizenship. And as a result now, certain acts, certain practices that we would not have really imagined as being about citizenship, now disability citizenship, keep doing this. Disability citizenship we talked about, and we see tangible physical effects of that particular experience. And we could just take other examples, a more contested and experimental one, for example, the citizenship for transgendered people. There's the discussion about transgender people have made themselves into actually subject of citizenship. And in a way, it crosses all three, but not in an obvious way. And I'm going to say something about that, the issue of the new subjects of citizenship. But it's not only that. We have experienced the beginning of new sites of citizenship. New sites, not just simply in the sort of physical, material, spatial sense of that term, but sites very much like what Foucault named as discursive field, or also Bourdieu's conception of the social field, these almost magnetic fields which bring different subjectivities into a dialogue with one another or conflict with one another and constitute certain domains of activity. And we have seen that various different sites that have emerged as sites of citizenship that we don't necessarily associate with traditional sites of citizenship. These range from a more traditional examples of civil rights movement making civil rights as a site of citizenship to, for example, ecological or environmental movements making the environment as a site of citizenship, drawing upon a variety of philosophies from deep ecology to animal subjectivities and so on that we can talk about. Now, that's not it either within citizenship. We have also seen the proliferation of scales of citizenship that at one point it might have been taken for granted that when one used citizenship, it was immediately delimited by the boundaries of the nation state, or let's say the state without complicating it. That is no longer at least a taken for granted assumption. That doesn't mean, and as many scholars have pointed this out, that doesn't mean that state citizenship has lost all its value or even effectivity. I don't know of too many people who have actually explicitly argued that. But at the same time, it has come into contestation with different scales through which citizenship is expressed. Mike Savory earlier mentioned, for example, cosmopolitan democracy. And then there's the debate about what kinds of institutions would be most appropriate to enact a cosmopolitan kind of citizenship.